we're told Antarctica was discovered in 1820. Two separate expeditions, one Russian, one British, spotted a frozen continent at the bottom of the world and mapped what they could see. The official timeline is clean. The continent was unknown before that point. Nothing was there before the ice. That is the accepted explanation. Now consider this. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, 37 years before official discovery, includes southern landmass. Not a vague suggestion of coastline, a detailed rendering. And, more specifically, it shows a coastline that matches, with measurable accuracy, the subglacial topography of Antarctica, the shape of the land beneath the ice, topography that was not confirmed by modern instruments until 1958. The official explanation accounts for the map's existence, but not its accuracy. That is where this investigation begins. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral. He documented his sources and marginal notes on the map itself, a practice unusual enough to treat seriously. He wrote that he compiled the map from approximately 20 older source charts, some of which he described as dating to the time of Alexander the Great. He was not claiming personal discovery. He was claiming to copy from something older. The question is not whether Piri Reis drew the map, he did. The question is what he was copying from, and how those source documents contained accurate subglacial coastal data for a continent that, by every accepted historical record, no human being had yet seen. The U.S. Air Force cartographer Harold Z. Ohlmeyer examined the map in 1960 at the request of a researcher. His formal response stated that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map matched seismic survey data for the Queen Maud Land coast of Antarctica, with a degree of accuracy that could not be explained by coincidence or guesswork. This was not a fringe interpretation. It was a technical assessment from a military cartographer. The official historical community's response was to question the methodology of the comparison. That is a reasonable response. But the map itself was not withdrawn from consideration. It still exists. The detail is still there, and the question of the source documents Piri Reis referenced has never been fully resolved. This is where the investigation requires a widening of scope, because the Piri Reis map does not stand alone. The Urantius Finaeus map of 1531 shows Antarctica with rivers, not coastline. Rivers, implying the cartographer, or his source, was depicting the continent in a condition before glaciation. The Bosch map of 1754 shows Antarctica divided into two land masses by an interior sea. That division was confirmed by seismic surveys in the 20th century. Philippe Bosch himself stated he was working from ancient charts of unknown origin. 3 separate maps, 3 separate centuries, 3 separate cartographers, all depicting a continent with an accuracy that exceeds what any known explorer of their respective eras could have produced. All 3 cartographers documenting that they were not working from first-hand observation. The mainstream explanation is that these maps represent speculative geography, educated guessing, based on the theory that a southern continent must exist to balance the northern landmasses. That explanation accounts for the existence of a southern landmass on the maps. It does not account for the accuracy of the interior topography. Speculation does not produce seismically confirmed subglacial river systems. Something was being copied. The origin of what was being copied is the unanswered part. Now the investigation requires a step back, not to Antarctica, but to a broader cartographic and architectural pattern that makes the Antarctic evidence significantly harder to dismiss in isolation. The Tartaria question. Tartaria appears on European maps from roughly the 13th century through to the early 19th century. On those maps, it occupies an enormous territory, much of Central Asia, Siberia, parts of Eastern Europe. It is labeled consistently. It has marked cities. It has labeled trade routes. Russian imperial maps reference it. German cartographic atlases reference it. The territory is not marginal. On some maps, it is among the largest labeled regions on the entire Eurasian landmass. Then, in the early 19th century, it disappears from maps entirely. Not gradually. The transition is abrupt. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria as a labeled geographic entity is gone. The territory it occupied is redistributed into the administrative regions of expanding empires. The cities it contained are absorbed without comment into new national identities. No conquest is documented that accounts for this. No formal dissolution, no treaty, no war that matches the scale of the territory. Empires that size do not vanish from cartographic records without a corresponding historical explanation. The absence of that explanation is itself a data point, the Tartaria hypothesis, and it should be called the hypothesis because the evidence does not reach the level of proof suggests that what European maps were labeling as Tartaria was not a loosely defined tribal region, but a coherent civilization with centralized architectural knowledge. The physical evidence used to support this comes not from texts, but from buildings. Across Siberia, Central Asia, and surprisingly, across North America, there is a category of 19th century civic architecture that presents a specific technical problem. The buildings are large, the masonry is precise. The materials, in many cases, show weathering and foundation depth inconsistent with their documented construction dates. And in numerous instances, construction records either do not exist or are incomplete in ways that would be unusual for buildings of that scale. This is not a claim that the buildings are ancient. The claim is more specific and more technical. The construction timeline, the available labor documentation, the material sourcing records, in many cases do not adequately explain what was built. The St. Louis Old Post Office, the Philadelphia City Hall, multiple state capitol buildings in the United States, constructed in the mid to late 1800s, share an architectural vocabulary, a specific visual language of domes, arched windows, rusticated stone bases, and proportional systems that matches contemporaneous architecture in cities across Russia, across Western Europe, and across parts of Central Asia. Not similar. Matching. The proportional systems are identical. The decorative grammar is identical. The official explanation is diffusion. Architectural styles spread through pattern books, through trained architects who studied in Europe, through shared aesthetic movements like neoclassicism and Beaux-Arts. That explanation is plausible. It accounts for the visual similarity. It does not fully account for the precision of construction in locations that, by population records of the time, would have had significant difficulty producing the required skilled labor in the documented timeframes. Here, the investigation becomes technical in a way that is difficult to dismiss. The question of 19th century population versus construction output is rarely asked directly in mainstream historical analysis. When it is asked, the answer involves large immigrant labor forces and the organizational capacity of industrializing economies. That answer is reasonable for some of the buildings. It becomes less reasonable when the inventory is expanded. Consider the following. In the United States alone, a period between 1850 and 1880 produced an inventory of large-scale civic buildings. Courthouses, post offices, custom houses, city halls, train stations. That, when totaled, represents a construction output that modern historical analysis has not fully modeled against available labor and material supply chains of the period. The railroads were being built simultaneously. Agricultural expansion was ongoing. The Civil War consumed an enormous portion of available labor and industrial capacity for 4 years within that window. The buildings were nevertheless completed. Some were completed very quickly by the standards of the day. Many have foundations and basement levels that go substantially deeper than the structures above them would require. That detail appears repeatedly across different buildings in different regions and is rarely discussed in official architectural histories. The question is not whether the buildings exist. They do. The question is what the full construction history of those buildings actually contains, and how much of that history has been preserved versus summarized versus lost. There is an additional layer to this architectural question that extends the pattern beyond American civic buildings. Examine the institutional structures built across the Russian interior during the same period. Kazan, Novosibirsk, Omsky, cities that were, according to official settlement records, relatively recently established frontier towns in the mid-19th century. The buildings that anchor those cities, the administrative centers, the cathedrals, the civic halls, are not the buildings of frontier towns. They are proportionally large, technically precise, and built in stone with a finish quality that frontier settlement timelines do not easily produce. The standard explanation is that the Russian imperial administration invested heavily in civic infrastructure as a tool of territorial consolidation. That explanation is historically documented and partially accounts for the building quality. What it does not account for is the speed. Russian imperial construction records for the Siberian interior are incomplete. The buildings predate, in several cases, the administrative records that are supposed to document their construction. The sequence is inverted. The building exists before the paperwork that should have authorized and recorded it. This inversion is not universal. It is not even common in absolute terms, but it appears frequently enough across a consistent geographic region, precisely the region that was labeled Tartaria on maps for 6 centuries, that it constitutes a pattern. Patterns require explanation. The current historical framework has not produced one. Return now to Antarctica, because the connection the title proposes is not primarily cartographic, it is geographic. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its most structured form, suggests that the civilization referred to as Tartaria on historical maps extended further than the Eurasian landmass, that it represented a global network of knowledge and possibly infrastructure, and that a significant portion of its physical presence was eliminated by a catastrophic event, potentially in the late 18th or early 19th century, the precise period when Tartaria disappears from maps and when the documentary record for large sections of the globe becomes sparse in ways that are difficult to fully explain. This is where the Antarctic element enters. If Tartaria extended into the southern hemisphere, if civilizational infrastructure existed in polar or subpolar regions, then the accelerated glaciation of the Antarctic continent, or the use of that glaciation as a natural mechanism for burial, would not be detectable by any surface survey. It would be buried under ice that, in some areas, is over 2 miles thick. This is not provable from current evidence, but it is not disproven either. The subglacial topography of Antarctica includes valleys, river systems, mountain ranges, features consistent with a land surface that was once above glaciation, a surface that was, at some point in geological history, accessible. The question of when that accessibility ended is a matter of active scientific debate. The mainstream position places full glaciation at approximately 34 million years ago, with a more recent expansion during the last ice age. There are researchers within the geological community who argue for more recent significant changes in Antarctic ice coverage. That debate is ongoing and unresolved. The Piri Reis map introduces a specific problem into that debate. Because of the map's subglacial accuracy is genuine, and it has not been disproven, then someone was observing an Antarctic coastline in a condition that official geology says was inaccessible within any period of human civilization. Either the geological timeline for Antarctic glaciation is more complicated than the current consensus allows, or the period of human civilization is longer or different than the current archaeological consensus allows. Or the cartographic accuracy of the Piri Reis map is coincidental. One of those three options must be true. The evidence does not currently allow for a clear elimination of any of them. There's a second layer to the Antarctic question that the cartographic evidence alone does not capture. Operation High Jump, conducted in 1946 and 1946, was a United States Navy operation involving 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and approximately 4,700 military personnel. It was officially described as a training exercise and a scientific survey. The scale of the operation, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, with significant post-war resource constraints, has never been fully explained by the scientific survey rationale alone. Scientific surveys of the period did not require carrier task forces. Admiral Richard Byrd, who commanded the operation, gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper in March of 1947 in which he described encountering resistance during the operation. The specific nature of that resistance, as documented in the interview, was described in terms that have been variously interpreted and disputed. What is not disputed is that the operation was terminated significantly earlier than its planned timeline, and that the official reporting on the operation's findings was classified for a period whose duration is itself not consistently reported across official sources. The 1959 Antarctic Treaty banned military activity on the continent and, notably, banned any excavation of the continent for resource or archaeological purposes. This is the only continent on Earth subject to such a comprehensive prohibition on subsurface investigation. The official explanation for this is environmental protection and the prevention of territorial conflict. Both are reasonable justifications. They do not, however, preclude the possibility that additional motivations inform the treaty's subsurface investigation provisions. The evidence does not support a direct claim, but the combination of factors, an oversized military operation, an early termination, classification of findings, and a subsequent international treaty prohibiting subsurface investigation, is a sequence that, in any other geographic context, would attract serious investigative attention. There is one further element of the Operation High Jump record that is not widely discussed in mainstream historical accounts of Antarctic exploration. The operation's photographic and film documentation was extensive. Aerial survey photography was a primary stated objective. The volume of photographic material produced during the operation was significant. The portion of that material that has been made publicly available is a fraction of what was documented as collected. The remainder exists in naval archive classifications whose review status has not been publicly updated since the mid-20th century. This is not, by itself, anomalous. Military operations routinely produce classified documentation. The specific point of interest here is the nature of what aerial survey photography of Antarctica would capture. Ground-penetrating radar was not available in 1947, but aerial photography in low-light polar conditions, conducted at scale over unexplored terrain, can document surface anomalies, structural regularities, geometric patterns, features inconsistent with purely geological formation. Whether such features were documented and whether such documentation exists within the classified photographic archive is not currently knowable from public records. What is knowable is that a formal request for declassification of the full high-jump photographic archive has not been submitted through publicly documented channels, and that the archive's contents have not been the subject of independent academic review. For an operation of that scale, conducted over 70 years ago, that absence of review is itself a question. The official historical framework for the early 19th century accounts for the Napoleonic Wars, the collapse of several major empires, a period of significant political reorganization, and, beginning around 1815, the year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora, which produced the largest volcanic event in recorded history and caused widespread agricultural failure, famine, and social disruption across the Northern Hemisphere. The year without a summer is in the record. Its effects were severe and well documented. What is less frequently examined is whether that event or a series of events in that general period could have served as cover, deliberately or incidentally, for the disappearance of a significant civilization from the documented record. The Tartaria mapped territory in Siberia and Central Asia experienced population changes in this period that are documented but not fully explained. The transition of certain Central Asian regions from independently governed to imperial administered happened with the speed and a completeness that contemporary European observers noted at the time. None of this is conclusive. It raises a question about the relationship between natural catastrophe, political reorganization, and the preservation of historical memory. There is a parallel that the investigation cannot avoid. The Library of Alexandria is the most well-known example of a knowledge repository whose destruction produced an irreversible gap in the historical record. It is cited frequently, and its loss is acknowledged as a genuine historical tragedy within the mainstream academic framework. The acknowledgement is comfortable because the library is gone. There is nothing left to investigate. The loss is historical, not ongoing. The more difficult question is whether comparable repositories of knowledge, not necessarily libraries in the architectural sense, but centers of accumulated technical and cartographic knowledge, existed in other locations and were eliminated in ways that left less visible traces. The Alexandrian model assumes a single, documented destruction event. A different model involves gradual suppression, administrative absorption, and the reclassification of existing knowledge under new institutional frameworks, a process that leaves the buildings standing while removing the context that explained them. That model does not require conspiracy. It requires only the normal operation of conquering administrative systems, which routinely reclassify, rename, and reattribute the infrastructure they inherit. The result, over several generations, is a built environment whose origins are attributed to the inheriting culture rather than to whatever preceded it. The buildings remain. The lineage does not. The standard response to the body of evidence explored here is that each piece has an individual explanation. The Piri Reis map reflects speculative cartography. The Tartaria label was a vague European term for tribal regions, not a coherent civilization. The construction anomalies reflect gaps in surviving records, not construction anomalies. The Antarctic Treaty was purely geopolitical. Each individual explanation is defensible. The more serious analytical question is whether the accumulation of individually defensible explanations, applied repeatedly to a consistent pattern of anomalies, represents genuine historical understanding or represents the formal management of questions that the existing framework cannot absorb. In any other field of investigation, a pattern this consistent and this geographically distributed would require a dedicated investigative response. The evidence would be formally collected, formally examined, and either formally explained or formally acknowledged as unexplained. That formal process has not occurred for this category of evidence. Individual anomalies are addressed individually and then set aside. The cumulative pattern is not addressed because addressing it as a pattern would require acknowledging that the pattern exists. The evidence does not disappear when the conversation moves on. The maps are still in the archives. The buildings are still standing. The subglacial topography is still there, under 2 miles of ice in a shape that was drawn on a map in 1513. The capability existed. The documentation of how it came to exist and where it went does not. What is buried under Antarctica, whether ice, sediment, or institutional silence, is not currently knowable from available evidence. The honest position is that the question has not been adequately investigated, and that the framework within which such investigation would occur has structural reasons to avoid it. The Piri Reis map does not prove a lost civilization mapped Antarctica before official discovery, but it documents that someone, at some point before 1513, had access to coastal data for a landmass that was not supposed to be known. That source has never been located. The Tartaria maps do not prove a global civilization was erased from history, but they document that a territory the size of a continent was labeled consistently on European maps for 6 centuries and then removed from the cartographic record within a single generation, without a corresponding documented explanation. The Antarctic Treaty does not prove that subsurface evidence of prior civilization is being protected from investigation, but it is the only international treaty that prohibits archaeological excavation of an entire continent, and the prohibition has held without serious challenge for over 60 years. The capability to know what is under the Antarctic ice exists. The technology for subglacial ground-penetrating survey has advanced significantly. The data from existing surveys has been partially published and partially withheld under scientific embargo protocols, whose justifications are not always made available for independent review. The ice preserves. That is its function. What it preserves, and whether any of it is what the Piri Reis cartographers and the Tartaria mapmakers were looking at, remains an open question, not because the evidence proves it, because the evidence has not been found, and the search has not been allowed.